What if everything you thought you knew about World War II was just the surface? Beneath the familiar history lie dark, disturbing secrets, hidden truths so terrifying that some tried to bury them forever. Today, we're opening a box that was never meant to be unlocked. Prepare yourself to face the shadows of a war that shaped the world, but also hid horrors you're not supposed to see. Are you ready to uncover what was kept in silence? In the summer of 1940, the world held its breath as Nazi Germany prepared to launch Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of the British Isles. History remembers this operation as a failure, a moment where the Royal Air Force valiantly defended Britain's skies during the Battle of Britain, forcing Hitler to delay and ultimately cancel the invasion. But what if events had taken a different turn? What if the Luftwaffe had won complete air superiority, allowing German forces to storm British shores and claim victory on England's soil? The initial weeks of this alternate campaign would be chaotic and brutal. Following the successful decimation of the RAF, German paratroopers and amphibious forces would have landed along the southern coast, overwhelming poorly prepared British coastal defenses. The Royal Navy, although formidable, would struggle to prevent massive troop landings in the face of relentless Luftwaffe air cover. Within weeks, strategic ports such as Dover, Portsmouth, and Plymouth would fall, creating supply hubs for the invasion forces. The fall of southern England would send shockwaves through the British government and population. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, faced with the collapse of the home front, would be forced to evacuate London and relocate the government to Canada or another dominion in exile. The British Isles would find themselves under Nazi occupation, with the Wehrmacht and SS forces imposing martial law across major cities. Resistance movements would rise but would be brutally suppressed, echoing the harsh occupation policies seen elsewhere in Europe. With Britain under Nazi control, the strategic landscape of World War II would shift dramatically. The loss of Britain as a base for Allied air and naval operations would cripple efforts to launch future offensives against Nazi Europe. The Atlantic supply routes, critical for transferring American war material to Europe, would be severely threatened, with German U-boats operating from British ports wreaking havoc on Allied convoys. The consequences for the Soviet Union would be profound. Without the pressure of an active Western front, Hitler could redirect vast resources and troops to the east, intensifying Operation Barbarossa. The USSR would face a stronger, better supplied Nazi war machine, making the already brutal battle for survival even more desperate. Without the Western allies to divide Nazi attention, the Soviets might struggle to halt the German advance, possibly losing key cities such as Moscow or Leningrad much earlier or completely. The United States, watching these developments unfold, would find its options limited. Without a liberated Britain, the Atlantic would be perilous, and American involvement in the European theater would be delayed or diminished. The U.S. might concentrate more heavily on the Pacific War against Japan, but would be forced to reconsider its strategy against Nazi Germany, possibly focusing on economic embargoes and support for underground resistance movements rather than direct military engagement. One of the darkest implications of Nazi control over Britain would be the acceleration and expansion of the Holocaust. Britain, as a refuge for many fleeing Nazi persecution, would no longer be a safe haven. Jewish refugees trapped in occupied Europe would face increased peril, and British Jews would be subject to Nazi racial laws, deportations, and exterminations. The infrastructure for deportation trains and death camps could extend into Britain, turning cities like London and Manchester into sites of horror previously unimaginable. The British resistance, while courageous, would be fragmented and isolated. Underground networks would conduct sabotage, espionage, and guerrilla warfare, but without external support or secure supply lines, their impact would be limited. The morale of the British people would be tested to its breaking point, with some collaborators emerging alongside fierce patriots. Internationally, the Axis powers would celebrate a massive propaganda victory. The fall of Britain would legitimize Nazi dominance in Europe and demoralize the Allied cause. Countries still neutral or wavering in their alliances might be tempted to side with the Axis, hoping to avoid the fate of Britain. The Mediterranean would be dominated by Axis forces, threatening British holdings in North Africa and the Middle East, and perhaps even cutting off access to vital oil supplies. However, resistance to Nazi Britain would not be confined to the islands. The Commonwealth nations, including Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, would become vital centers for the Allied war effort. From these distant bastions, military planning and production would continue, keeping the hope of liberation alive. The United States, despite its initial hesitation, might eventually be pushed to intervene directly, launching daring operations to reclaim Europe from Nazi control. In the psychological realm, the occupation of Britain would shatter the myth of the invincible British bulldog. Hitler's perceived invincibility would grow, potentially leading to reckless overconfidence in Nazi leadership. But beneath the surface, a different tide might be brewing, one of desperate resilience, underground defiance, and international alliances forged in the fires of oppression. This alternate history forces us to confront how precarious the outcome of World War II truly was. It reveals how a single shift, air superiority lost by Britain, could have led to a drastically different world, where Nazi tyranny extended across the Atlantic, reshaping global geopolitics, culture, and human destiny. Yet, even in such a dark scenario, human courage and the will to resist might have sown the seeds for eventual liberation. Type next to continue to the next story. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 galvanized the United States to join the Allied powers and fight against the Axis. It became a pivotal moment, bringing American industrial might and military strength decisively into the global conflict. But what if that attack had never happened, or if the United States had chosen to maintain strict neutrality until 1945? How might the war have unfolded without American involvement for its majority? In this alternate reality, isolationism reigns supreme in Washington. Despite increasing Axis aggression in Europe, Africa, and Asia, the U.S. government, wary of repeating the losses of World War I, enforces stringent neutrality laws. Roosevelt's efforts to support the Allies with Lend-Lease aid are stymied by Congress, which insists on keeping America out of foreign entanglements. The Atlantic remains a dangerous battleground, but American warships stay in harbor. The immediate impact of American neutrality would be a prolonged and bloodier conflict in Europe and the Pacific. Without U.S. industrial output supplying weapons, ammunition, and vehicles to Britain and the Soviet Union, the Allied war effort faces critical shortages. The British Empire, already strained by earlier losses, struggles to hold Africa and the Middle East against Axis offensives. The Soviet Union, fighting brutal battles on the Eastern Front, receives only limited material support. With no American troops arriving in Europe, major Allied operations such as the invasion of North Africa, the Italian campaign, and D-Day are either delayed or never launched. Nazi Germany, freed from the pressure of a second front, can focus more troops and resources against the Soviets. Operation Barbarossa gains momentum, and the Soviet Union suffers heavier losses. Cities like Stalingrad fall, and Moscow faces constant threat, shaking the foundation of Soviet resistance. In the Pacific, Japan's expansion continues unchallenged. Without U.S. naval power to check its ambitions, Japan consolidates control over Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, cutting off crucial Allied supply routes. The Philippines fall early and without a major American counteroffensive. Australia stands isolated, vulnerable to invasion or blockade, while British forces in Asia are forced to retreat to India. The Holocaust, already unfolding with horrifying speed, gains a more sinister dimension. The lack of U.S. pressure on Axis regimes emboldens Nazi Germany to intensify genocidal policies. Without the promise of eventual Allied victory, resistance movements across occupied Europe struggle to receive arms and aid. Refugees hoping for sanctuary find fewer safe harbors, as neutral countries face pressure not to harbor escapees. Politically, the prolonged war sows instability worldwide. The Soviet Union, bearing the brunt of Axis military might, suffers devastating casualties and resource depletion, weakening its post-war influence. Britain, exhausted and isolated, faces growing unrest and political fragmentation. The Axis powers, particularly Germany and Japan, grow bolder, emboldened by the absence of American engagement. By 1944, the Allies remain on the defensive, their hopes pinned on the eventual entry of the United States into the war. In Washington, debate rages over whether to abandon neutrality in the face of mounting Axis victories and atrocities. Public opinion shifts slowly as news of the horrors in Europe filters in, but the political will to act remains fractured. It is only in early 1945, when Nazi forces launch a desperate blitzkrieg through weakened Soviet lines and threaten to seize the entire continent, that America finally commits its full military might. By this time, however, the war has dragged on for years longer than in actual history, with tens of millions more dead and much of Europe in ruins. The late American intervention hastens the collapse of the Axis, but at a terrible cost. Europe is divided into spheres of influence even more starkly than in reality, with a much stronger Soviet presence across the continent. The United States, having waited until the last moment, emerges as a reluctant superpower, struggling to shape a post-war order from the ashes of a more prolonged and devastating conflict. This alternate history reveals the fragile balance of World War II. The United States' timely involvement was not just a matter of military power, but a pivotal element that kept the war's duration and casualties from spiraling out of control. Without American engagement, the global landscape would have been scarred by deeper wounds and a far different geopolitical map, one where democracy's survival hung by a thinner thread. Type Next to continue to the next story. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, catching the Soviet Union by surprise and setting the stage for some of the most brutal battles of World War II. Despite early German advances, the operation ultimately bogged down, and the Red Army rallied to push back the invaders. But what if this crucial campaign had failed not after months, but catastrophically within its first weeks? What if the Soviet defenses shattered the German invasion force entirely in the summer of 1941? In this alternate timeline, the Soviet Union, forewarned by improved intelligence and less hampered by Stalin's purges of the military leadership, prepares extensive defenses along the western border. When German forces cross into Soviet territory, they encounter well-fortified positions, deep trenches, and massed armored units waiting to counterattack. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics, so effective in earlier campaigns, stumble against the unexpected Soviet readiness. The first phase of Operation Barbarossa turns into a nightmare for the Germans. The Luftwaffe fails to dominate Soviet airspace, facing fierce resistance from a rapidly mobilized Red Air Force. German panzer divisions, overextended and slowed by difficult terrain, find themselves encircled in several key battles near Minsk and Smolensk. Soviet forces, using deep reserves, launch counteroffensives that cut off German supply lines and force retreats. Within weeks, the German army suffers massive casualties, losing tens of thousands of men and hundreds of tanks. The myth of German invincibility cracks as Soviet soldiers reclaim territory swiftly, pushing westward into Eastern Europe. Stalin, emboldened by this victory, orders a full-scale offensive aimed at driving the Nazis back across the pre-1939 borders and beyond. The failure of Barbarossa triggers political turmoil within Nazi Germany. Hitler's generals, shocked by the disastrous losses, debate abandoning the Eastern campaign or shifting focus. However, Hitler doubles down, ordering reinforcements and harsher measures in occupied territories, fueling brutal reprisals and deepening resistance movements. The Western Allies observe the situation with growing hope. Britain, still fighting to survive, accelerates plans to open a second front sooner, confident that Soviet resilience will hold the Eastern Front. The United States, following its entry into the war, increases aid and prepares for coordinated operations in Europe. By late 1942, Soviet troops have liberated much of Ukraine and Belarus, pushing German forces into a defensive posture. The Red Army begins to advance toward Poland and the Baltic states, intent on reclaiming lost ground and expanding Soviet influence. Berlin itself feels the pressure as Soviet long-range artillery and air raids grow more frequent. This Soviet momentum reshapes the Allied war strategy. With a weakened German Eastern Front, the Western Allies plan smaller, targeted operations rather than massive invasions. The liberation of France and Western Europe is delayed but more coordinated with Soviet advances. The Axis powers find themselves fighting a war on multiple collapsing fronts. The war's brutal nature intensifies as desperation grows on both sides. Nazi Germany escalates its genocidal policies, attempting to maintain control through terror and mass extermination. However, the Soviet victory energizes resistance groups across occupied Europe, who coordinate more effectively with the advancing Red Army and Western allies. In the post-war world, a Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe emerges even earlier and with greater influence. The rapid Soviet advance into Central Europe results in tighter control over Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and even parts of Germany. This shift sets the stage for an earlier Cold War, with the Iron Curtain descending sooner and more decisively. The United States and Western Europe face a world where Soviet communism occupies a broader territory, challenging democracy and capitalism on a larger scale. The United Nations, formed in the war's aftermath, struggles to balance the competing superpowers' interests as ideological tensions ignite. This catastrophic failure of Operation Barbarossa forces us to reconsider how fragile and contingent the war's outcome truly was. The fate of millions hinged on the Soviet Union's ability to hold the line and counterattack. Without this resilience, Nazi Germany might have secured its eastern flank and prolonged its domination of Europe, possibly altering the entire trajectory of the 20th century. Type Next to continue to the next story. The atomic bomb is often seen as the decisive factor that ended World War II and ushered in the atomic age. Historically, it was the United States that developed and deployed this devastating weapon, bringing Japan to surrender and shifting global power dynamics. But what if Nazi Germany had succeeded in creating the atomic bomb first? This alternate history explores the terrifying implications of a world where Adolf Hitler held nuclear power. In the early 1940s, Nazi Germany invested heavily in advanced scientific research. The Uranverein, or Uranium Club, was tasked with developing nuclear weapons, but faced challenges including resource shortages, internal political rivalries, and bombastic interference from Nazi leadership. Yet in this alternate timeline, German scientists break through these obstacles faster, making unexpected leaps in nuclear physics with the assistance of forced labor and captured Allied scientists. By mid-1944, Germany completes the construction of its first atomic bomb. Secretly tested in the deserts of occupied Eastern Europe, the weapon proves devastatingly effective. Hitler, informed of this success, orders the immediate preparation of nuclear strikes to solidify Nazi dominance and terrorize the remaining Allied nations into submission. The first target is the United Kingdom. In a terrifying show of power, Berlin launches a bomb on London, obliterating vast portions of the city and killing hundreds of thousands instantly. The destruction shatters British morale and cripples command structures. Other European cities, including Paris and Warsaw, face similar fates as Nazi Germany wields nuclear terror to suppress resistance and consolidate control over occupied territories. The United States, stunned by the news of the German atomic bomb, accelerates its own Manhattan Project in a desperate race. However, with Berlin's bomb already in use, American scientists work under the shadow of Nazi nuclear supremacy. Allied military strategy shifts from direct confrontation to covert operations and sabotage attempts aimed at destroying Germany's nuclear infrastructure. Japan, emboldened by its Axis allies' nuclear arsenal, intensifies its campaign in Asia. However, the geopolitical landscape is drastically altered. The atomic threat from Germany forces the United States to reconsider a direct invasion of Japan, fearing catastrophic nuclear retaliation. The Pacific War drags on, characterized by increased bombings, guerrilla warfare, and the looming specter of nuclear devastation. The Holocaust, already a horrific genocide, takes on an even darker scale. With nuclear weapons backing Nazi policies, the regime accelerates extermination efforts, crushing uprisings and resistance with terrifying efficiency. Ghettos and camps in Eastern Europe become death traps under threat of annihilation. Jewish and other persecuted populations face near-total eradication in Nazi-held territories. Internationally, Nazi Germany's nuclear dominance forces neutral and occupied countries into submission or collaboration. Many governments in exile lose hope of reclaiming their homelands. The Axis powers impose a brutal Pax Germanica, using atomic terror to deter rebellion and challenge the remaining Allied forces. The Soviet Union, recognizing the existential threat, mobilizes all remaining resources to counterattack. Massive conventional offensives attempt to overwhelm German positions before further nuclear strikes can be deployed. Yet the psychological and material advantages of the atomic bomb force the Soviets onto the defensive, prolonging the war's devastation. In the United States, a secret network of scientists, spies, and resistance fighters works tirelessly to steal Nazi nuclear secrets and develop countermeasures. This underground effort, fraught with danger, becomes the cornerstone of future post-war intelligence and scientific collaboration. The post-war world, if there is one, would be shaped by Nazi nuclear supremacy. Europe and parts of Asia remain under the shadow of atomic occupation, and the balance of power shifts dramatically toward totalitarianism. The Cold War, if it emerges, takes a darker turn as nuclear proliferation spreads from the Axis to other powers in a desperate bid to counterbalance Nazi dominance. This chilling what-if scenario forces us to appreciate the delicate interplay of science, politics, and war. The atomic bomb's power could have enabled one of history's most brutal regimes to reign unchecked, changing the face of the modern world and threatening the very survival of human civilization. Type next to continue to the next story. June 6, 1944, the day history remembers as D-Day, marked the beginning of the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Western Europe. Operation Overlord was a monumental effort involving meticulous planning, incredible bravery, and enormous risk. Its success paved the way for the liberation of France and ultimately led to the collapse of Nazi Germany. But what if the Normandy landings had failed catastrophically? What if the German defenses had crushed the invasion force on the beaches of Normandy? In this alternate scenario, German commanders, forewarned by better intelligence and prepared with reinforced coastal defenses, unleash a devastating defense. The Atlantic Wall, a network of bunkers, artillery, minefields, and obstacles, is far stronger than in reality. The Luftwaffe, although weakened, manages to muster enough air support to harass and disrupt the landing fleets. Bad weather conditions and confusion add to the chaos faced by the invading troops. As the landing crafts approach the beaches, thousands of Allied soldiers are cut down by withering machine gun fire, artillery barrages, and underwater mines. The infamous Omaha Beach becomes a slaughterhouse, with waves of troops pinned down in the surf or trapped behind barbed wire. Similar fates befall landings at Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword beaches. Amphibious tanks struggle to move forward under intense fire, and communication breakdowns prevent coordinated attacks inland. Attempts to establish beachheads fail repeatedly. The Allies suffer heavy casualties, tens of thousands killed, wounded, or captured within hours. Naval and air support are unable to provide sufficient cover due to poor weather and fierce German resistance. By the end of the first day, the invasion force is in full retreat or destroyed, and the dream of opening a Western front appears shattered. The failure of D-Day sends shockwaves through the Allied command. Morale plummets in Britain and the United States. Questions arise about the leadership of General Eisenhower and whether the operation was ever viable. Hitler, emboldened by this stunning victory, orders counteroffensives aimed at crushing the battered British Isles and possibly launching new attacks in the Mediterranean. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union faces a grimmer situation. Without the distraction of a Western Front, German forces reinforce their positions against the Red Army. The Battle of Stalingrad, already fierce, extends into a prolonged siege, with Nazi forces able to divert more troops and resources. The Soviet advance stalls, leading to heavier casualties and delayed liberation of Eastern Europe. In Britain, the population braces for possible German invasion or intensified bombing raids. Resistance movements in occupied Europe struggle with limited external support. The prolonged war drains Allied resources and tests international alliances. Political unrest grows in Allied nations, with calls for new strategies and leadership. American involvement in the war, though still significant, shifts. Without the success of a Western Front invasion, the U.S. intensifies its focus on the Pacific theater, seeking to defeat Japan independently. The atomic bomb project accelerates, but its use against Japan becomes more isolated without a European victory to complement it. The war drags on into the late 1940s, characterized by brutal attrition and shifting battle lines. Nazi Germany consolidates control over much of Western Europe, tightening its grip with brutal repression and intensified genocide. The Holocaust reaches even darker depths as Nazi confidence soars and resistance falters. The geopolitical aftermath of a failed D-Day is profound. Europe remains divided and dominated by Axis powers for years longer. The Soviet Union, strained and exhausted, gains some ground in the East but faces a stalemate that prevents decisive victory. The United States emerges as the dominant global power but faces a world where fascism has a stronger foothold. This grim alternate history underscores the razor-thin margin between victory and catastrophe in World War II. The success of D-Day was not inevitable. It required extraordinary courage, sacrifice, and a measure of luck. Its failure could have reshaped the 20th century, extending one of humanity's darkest chapters. The end. Now that the box is open, the disturbing secrets of World War II can no longer be ignored or forgotten. These hidden horrors remind us how close humanity came to unspeakable darkness, and how fragile the line between history and nightmare really is. Remember, some truths are buried for a reason, but knowing them is the only way to ensure they never rise again. Dare to question what you thought you knew. The story is far from over.